that we have a system that is the way in which the economy works today. System one. It's been built up over centuries, but it's been built up in particular in a very carbon intensive way. We need to look future back and understand the system, the economic system, that will function on a net zero basis. And we also incorporate into that how can it be also nature positive and more socially inclusive. But we need to look out to the future and say, what does System 2 look like, which by design has a built-in zero carbon, nature positive and socially just set of parameters and dynamics. So we have System 1 and we have System 2. And the task of system change is to accelerate, if you will, the growth of System 2, right? The future that we need to see and build, and to bring it to the present quicker than would otherwise be the case. And we need to accelerate the speed with which System 1 essentially shrinks. So that is system change in a nutshell. It is inherently political. There's no two ways around it, because our institutions and the interest groups and the policy settings and the way we live are embedded in System 1 today, and the political, if you will, economy of our current system is very powerful. And so that transition from System 1 to System 2 is one where you have to understand the political economy of the change, but we'll never get there unless we start with a very clear and powerful understanding of the opportunity and the prize that System 2 represents. So it's of course central, and you know, the investment capital has at its heart three things that it needs to do. One is that the more, if you will, active and entrepreneurial forms of that capital, and sometimes the impact forms of that capital, are going to be early investors in System 2. Right? They're going to be the venture investors, right, in the enterprises and ideas and platforms and possibilities of a System 2 world. So we desperately need the investment community to allocate capital and take risk into System 2. Second thing that the investment community needs to do is to get really sharp and challenging about the real return characteristics, right, and the resilience of the returns in System 1. Because properly understood, those returns are, even from a commercial point of view, unlikely to be sustainable. And they have to work their way through redoing the spreadsheets and the parameters and the assumptions and the mental models that lock investment capital into System 1, and begin to recognize that those System 1 investments are much riskier than they had previously understood, and therefore, in fact, the cost of capital ought to be much higher. So that's the second thing that it needs to do. So take the risk on System 2, begin to properly understand and price capital for a much higher risk version of System 1. And then the third thing is to work with policymakers, right, to actually shift the policy frameworks and the incentives in such a way that it supports what I described earlier. Faster scale up of System 2, so that they can begin to create that flywheel of more capital and more return and cost down and S-curve improvements in technological performance. And at the same time, if you will, enable a more orderly, it will never be perfectly, but a more orderly transition away from system one. So they've got three jobs: capital to the future, less capital to yesterday's, if you will, system, and encouraging and supporting policy dynamics that will allow us to build the future we want. But what's interesting at the moment is that there is a fundamental shift towards the use of green hydrogen in the economy. Right? It's early. So you get the evangelists that will tell you it's already here. But the idea that, in fact, we can take renewable energy, we can actually translate that into kind of hydrogen molecules that can be sources of clean energy, in effect, for shipping fuel, for fertilizer, for steel production. All of those things were seen to be fantasy land kind of 5-10 years ago, even 5 years ago. But now you're seeing really serious providers of capital wanting to put money into the investment assets that are needed to build the new hydrogen economy. And that includes your renewable energy and your electrolyzers and the storage systems and the use cases, right? The use of hydrogen in different forms, and often in the form of green ammonia. So you're seeing all of that and the capital formation going from venture capital through to growth equity capital, through to infrastructure forms of capital, beginning to see how that stack comes together. And the places where it's going and where you sense a real liftoff, either happening today or close enough where you can smell it, is where the policymakers also recognize that if they want to have industrial clusters that are based around the principles of a net zero green economy, they as policymakers need to, if you will, just shift the incentives, make green more valuable than brown, and put just enough public capital into forms of infrastructure that can enable that whole unlocking of private capital into the, if you will, the economy that we need to build. You start by having a picture of the new system that's needed. So just picking off an asset, saying, oh, I'm going to be interested in this bit of the value chain, isn't going to be the kind of the winning investment strategy. The investment strategies that work are ones that have if you will, a picture, analytically, rigorously, if you will, thought through, of what does that value chain look like, right? Around green hydrogen, around regenerative forms of agriculture, around alternative proteins, around electrification of transport. The set of opportunities, right, from the built environment through to the mobility space, through to industrial activities like green steel, through to shipping and aviation, through to agriculture. These are investment opportunities for each of which we need to essentially reinvent the value chain on the design principle of net zero, and then that itself will create a whole host of different investment opportunities, some of which will look like venture, some of which will look growth, some of which will look like infra, and some of which do need to have public as well as private capital to get the whole system to work. But there's a case. There's a business case, there's a political economy case that's about jobs and economic prosperity, and there is also an investment commercial case. And the advice I would offer to investors is, if you want to win in the new game, take a value chain approach, understand that within the system, lay out the capital requirements, lay out, if you will, the different forms of return from environmental return to social return to commercial return, and then effectively build your own piece of it, but in combination with the other actors that need to mobilize their forms of capital into the value chain. That is, of course, what Systemic does for a living, right? We help shape and design the new value chains. We look to help not individual actors to come together with other, if you will, stakeholders that have a natural interest in building a new value chain and a system that can work, and a system that is intelligently de-risked, and that is the basis upon which we're going to build the new net zero economy. I think it's easy to take the, if you will, the position which is, this is also complicated and also difficult. That we, are kind of the best we can do is somewhat improve what we've got. Our experience over now 6 years is that there are remarkable changes and new combinations of actor and opportunities that are coming to life, honestly, much faster than I would have thought. And I think if we can bring the most, if you will, entrepreneurial capital, together with the, if you will, more institutional capital and public and philanthropic capital, my goodness, we can build something better together.